Good evening, everybody. Good evening. I have to say this, but Tom Brady came out of retirement. Did everyone know that? I just can't believe it, but I had to. Someone just said you got to know the news. Yes, he did. He said he just missed the Tampa Bay Buccaneers so much. So anyway, I had to get that out of the way. I am. Okay, now we're really going to record. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to have Rabbi Kurtz introduce Rabbi Yitzchak Blau in a moment, but I want to thank Marina, who's our coach, who's our chair of adult education. Thank you so much for being that force of adult education. And Michael Feldstein, who is the wind beneath our wings. I mean, it's not only Agudath Sholom, bicultural, Young Israel, always looking to create Torah opportunities, and really appreciate you bringing the suggestion of Rabbi Blau to our community. We know each other for many years. His father is a mentor and a good friend when I was in Yeshiva University. And when my brother and I were in Israel for our gap year, I was learning at Ori Yerushalayim, and Rabbi Blau was learning at Torahs Moshe with Rav Meiselman. And my brother and Rabbi Blau were chavrusas. This is in the mid-1980s. So we go back a long way, and he has a real shem tov in Oraita now, and Hashem should bless you with continued good health, nachas, and spread your wonderful Torah, not only in Yerushalayim, but it is being felt here. And thank you so much for coming this evening. Without further ado, Rabbi Kurtz.
Thank you, Rabbi Cohen, and thank you everyone for coming out this evening. I don't need to repeat all the thank yous you said already. I repeat them, ditto. So I want to welcome Rabbi Blau, who generously came out to share Torah with us this evening. I think pretty much everyone here in some capacity is familiar with Rabbi Blau, hence you are here. But in case you don't know, we'll share a few of the accolades. Rabbi Yitzchak Blau is, of course, the Rosh Yeshiva and Shana Bet Ram at Yeshiva Oraita. He has taught previously at Yeshiva HaMiftar, Yeshiva Shivlei HaTorah, and Yeshiva Flatbush, and currently also teaches at Midrasha Lindenbaum. Rabbi Blau has a bachelor's in English literature from YU, an MA in medieval Jewish history from Revel, and Smicha from REITs. Rabbi Blau lives in a lone shvut with his wife and 4 children. And what makes this a special connection for us, not just another scholar in residence lecture, is that a number of you who are with us this evening, we actually have a Thursday morning study club. You guys can hold your books up for those who brought it. We're looking forward to the autographs, hopefully after this year. But Rabbi Blau is the author of Fresh Fruit and Vintage Wine, The Ethics and Wisdom of the Aggada, which is, of course, what we're going to be learning in a moment. And it's just been a privilege to be learning from your work. I think it's been over half a year, maybe even close to a year, that we meet every Thursday morning. We meet upstairs in the base medrash, and this is our book club that we've been going through your books and using it to understand the key Aggadatas in Shas. I'll say also that something special you're not going to touch on, I think, this evening, is that Rabbi Blau also is a key modern Orthodox thinker, but it doesn't stop him from also constructively critiquing modern Orthodoxy when needed. So I think I have an essay coming out where I cite you at least twice talking about Judaism and media consumption. And I know that's not your topic tonight, but certainly there's a lot to read from Rabbi Blau in Aggada and beyond. So without any further ado, it's our honor to have you with us at Agudath Sholom.
Thank you, Rabbi Cohen and Rabbi Kurtz, for your very kind words. It's not so often I get to speak somewhere where everybody has my book already. It's very exciting. Okay, so I am going to tell a story to start, which I think is a good lesson for all of us. I think whenever we're critiqued, most of us have a very instant defense mechanism. It can't be that the critic is right, and we're going to explain why the critic got it totally wrong. So sometimes it pays to wait a little bit before you have that instinctive reactions. Here's an example. When I came out with my book, so a woman named Simi Peters, a very nice person who teaches in Yerushalayim, so she wrote a review. And it was mostly positive. It was a positive review. But she said that the book had no methodology. Meaning, it was like, oh, here are 80 readings, but I'm not going to tell you how to go about doing so. What are the questions you should ask, etc. So at the time, I had this fierce response, why you don't need a methodology. And thank God I didn't publish it, because about half a year later, I decided she was right. So it's a good lesson for life, I think. Like if you're have that instinctive reaction and you want to smash your critic, just wait a little bit and see what happens. Okay, so we're going to try to develop, I guess this should have been the first chapter of the book, but we'll do it now. Okay, so what are some techniques that we could almost create rules for? Obviously, the rules are not going to be hard and fast, but general rules for interpreting Aggada. So let's start with one key aspect. Certainly in stories, there's a lot of symbolism. And the symbolism could be an object that has symbolic import, a name that has symbolic import, and the like. So let me ask you a question. Obviously, there's a certain subjective quality to interpreting literature. What might make you suspect, if you read a Talmudic story, that something has symbolic import? Like if we could try to give some rough guidelines, okay, what would it be about it that would say, oh, I should take note of this? Because not every object in the story, not every name is going to be full of significance. Sometimes you just have a name because people have to have a name, right? So, anyone, what association might you have that would make you think it's symbolic? Anyone with a suggestion? Okay, let's try the following. What if I write a story where there's a snake in a garden? What would you think? Okay, so obviously, if it has biblical resonance, if it has resonance with a biblical story, you'll start to suspect that it was intended. What if it is not a biblical resonance, but it has inter-Talmudic resonance? It's an object that seems to come up again and again. For example, what tree is ubiquitous in Aggadic stories? For some strange reason, the carob tree. I don't know why, but carob trees come up in Choni, the circle drawer. Carob trees come up in the story of Shimon Bar Yochai in the cave, right? Somehow carob trees come up again and again. One starts to suspect that there's something going on there. Maybe the carob tree has some symbolic import. Okay. Thirdly, this I'm not going to discuss tonight. What if it's kind of out of place? You really wouldn't expect that kind of object. So I don't know if Rabbi Kurtz has done this with you, but there's a famous story where prospective converts come to Shammai and Hillel. Does anyone remember what Shammai chases them out with? He's not so happy with their seriousness. What object does he use to chase them out? Okay, so it's a measuring rod of a builder. Okay, which is why some people think Shammai was an architect, which I think might not be shot. But in any case, couldn't you argue that that's a little arbitrary? Like of all items that he had in the Beit Midrash to chase them out, look, it had to be like a measuring rod of a builder. One starts to suspect that no, that is of symbolic import. So we're going to look inside at examples now, but I would say right away we already have three things that might strike us. Okay, one, it has biblical resonance or inter-Talmudic resonance. Actually, we could call that two. And also, what if it seems superfluous and unnecessary? Okay, now let's try. I'm going a little out of order here. Okay, let's try just a killer example. Sometimes when I do this in Bible also, I know Adiri heard me speak about this. You try to pick an example which you just can't, the audience just can't deny. It's just so clear this is what's going on. So we're going to start with an undeniable example. Everyone go to source 9. Okay, you'll all see, I think, those more knowledgeable, those less knowledgeable. I think there's something in this story that will be, you just can't miss it. Okay, here we go. So there's a Gemara in Yoma about a man named Nicanor who brought copper doors for the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, I'm going to read it in English. Okay, when Nicanor went to bring copper doors to the eastern gate of the temple from Alexandria in Egypt, I guess Alexandria was a major city where you could acquire things. Okay, on his return voyage by ship, a storm rose in the sea and threatened to drown him. The ships, now again, obviously when things are tough, you start to throw heavy items off the ship. So the best items would be these two metal doors. The ship's passengers took one of the doors and cast it into the sea. And still the sea did not rest from its rage. They sought to cast the other door into the sea, at which point Nicanor stood and embraced it and said to them, "Cast me into the sea with it." Immediately the sea rested from its rage. He regretted the fate of the other door that he allowed them to cast into the sea. Okay, so he's very upset because he only took a stand on the second door and he lost his first door. He lost the first donation. Okay, now before I read on, what biblical story is obviously in the background? Yonah, very good. Now, it's almost as if the Gemara said, if you didn't get it yet, we're going to smash you with it. Look at the next line. Okay, when they arrived at the port of Akko, the door that was thrown into the sea was poking out under the sides of the ship. So the first approach to the story is the door kind of swam along with them, and that's why they were able to have it in the end. What's the second approach? And some say a sea creature swallowed it and spewed it onto the land. Okay, can we all agree that there's no question that the rabbis who wrote this story wanted you to think of Sefer Yonah? Can we say that this is not contestable? Okay, there's so many parallels. Okay, but here's where things get tricky. Because when I know that someone wants me to make a connection, it's a little tricky. Well, what am I supposed to make of the connection? And I think often, is it really more of a comparison or more of a contrast? And here I admit, in this particular one, it's hard to prove, although I'm going to make my own suggestion. I'm just going to throw it to the crowd for a second. Anyone have some thoughts about what we're both supposed to make of Nicanor and Yonah? Are they similar? Are they dissimilar? Okay, clearly, again, this Talmudic story is meant to make us think of Sefer Yonah. Okay, anyone have a thought? Is Nicanor like Yonah or unlike Yonah? Okay, what do you think? Why is he not like Yonah?
Well, he's not fleeing from something God asked him to do.
Okay, great. Not only that, what is Yonah's posture on the ship? It's true that Yonah had that's what? And I would say he's apathetic. Where's Yonah during the storm when everybody's praying to their God? He's in the belly of the ship sleeping, right? So it's true Yonah's willing to be thrown overboard, but I would say that's more out of almost apathy than out of heroism, right? That's not what's going on. Where Nicanor here, again, there's nothing apathetic about Nicanor. Nicanor is fiercely committed to donating these doors to the Beit HaMikdash. So even though he also says, throw me in, I think it's a very different kind of throw me in. It's a throw me in that comes from a place of great dedication and idealism. So again, that's the suggestion I would make, that we're supposed to think of the Yonah story, but really as a contrast. Okay, great. Let's go. I'm going to go out of order again, if you don't mind. Let us go to source number 4. This is a bit of a long story, but I think a lot of you know it, so I think we'll be able to go through it pretty quickly. And I think this is a great story because it's going to combine 3 different questions. Okay, about symbolic import, but also one thing I didn't raise yet. Okay, one could also, another methodology for Aggada might be placement. Where did Chazal put the story? Now, I agree, you could explain placement in very technical terms. Meaning, one way to view it is Chazal had a lot of good stories, and they were just waiting for some association where they could insert it. I admit that's a possibility. One doesn't have to have like deep meaning on every question. But you could say sometimes, oh, this really belongs in this Masechet. This really belongs in this parak. So I'd say we should also ask, is there a reason why the story is placed where it is? And here there's something really fascinating. It doesn't happen so often that Hasidic rebbes and modern Jewish academics come together. Okay, but here's a good example, if you ever want an example. Okay, because Rav Tzadok HaKohen from Lublin was very insistent on finding meaning in the placement. We'll see a source in a minute. He was very insistent upon it. And modern academics, people like Jeff Rubenstein and Tani Feintuch, do the same thing. So it's kind of fascinating. I often write, by the way, Jeff Rubenstein, if you ever hear him, he's a great Aggadic reader, really great. But occasionally I write him to point out where his ideas are paralleled in the traditional Mefarshim. Because I guess in the academic world, you're not really checking the Pnei Yeshua. So I'll send him, and he gets excited about it, actually. So let's see what we have here in Rashum Barachai. Okay, and this is a great example because there's almost a red herring here. This is the famous, you see what I mean in a second. This is Rashum Barachai in the cave. Let's see the English. Why did they call him head of the speakers in every place? Yehuda gets this great title. He's Rosh HaMedabrim B'chol Makom. What does that mean? Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon were sitting, and Yehuda, son of convert, sat beside them. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda opened. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit just for the sake of time. Many of you are probably familiar with this. They're discussing the Roman authorities. Rabbi Yehuda praises the authorities. Rabbi Yossi is silent and neutral, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is very critical. Okay, so that is the threesome. As we know, guys, there aren't so many secrets in this world. So word gets back to the Roman authorities. Like many tyrannical regimes, the Roman authorities didn't really enjoy criticism. I guess they didn't learn my lesson. They have to just wait half a year, I suppose. Okay, so the Romans were pretty upset. So what the Romans say, so they famously say, Shimon Bar Yochai has a death sentence for being critical of us. And apparently even neutrality wasn't good enough. Rabbi Yossi, who was neutral, has to go into exile to Tzipori. Rabbi Yehuda, who praised us, he gets prominent reward. Now, what's the prominent reward? He becomes the chief speaker. It's almost like the Romans say, guess what, Jews? Every public event, Rabbi Yehuda has to be the keynote speaker, right? We are very excited about him, and he gets a reward. So notice what just happened. It seems like, why is this story here? Doesn't it seem like rather tangential and associative? This story is just here because we needed to explain how Rabbi Yehuda became the chief speaker, how he got that title. Okay, let's keep in mind if there might be another deeper reason at work here. Okay, let's go. Okay, so we're now in the second paragraph. They went and I just want to ask you again, Just like we found Yonah resonance in the Yoma story, let's think, do we get any biblical resonance in this story? Is there some figure who comes to mind? Rabbi Kurtz, do you want to say something? Interesting. Okay, so Rabbi Kurtz is right. I wonder if there's almost like a Talmudic type scene in which three wise men take a position on something. That'd be very interesting. Can you think of a third example? That's interesting. I have to think about that. No, that's good. Okay, and you wonder if is it always going to be, right? Exactly. I wonder if the type scene is always going to be yes, no, and neutral, as it were. Very interesting. Okay, excellent. Okay, they went and they hid in a cave. A miracle occurred, and a cab tree. Remember, we said cab trees are pretty ubiquitous, and a cab tree was created for them as well as a spring of water. They would remove their clothes and sit covered in sand up to their necks. They would study Torah all day in that manner. Right? They don't want their clothes to get ruined, so this way they're not wearing their clothes every day. Okay, at the time of prayer, they would dress, cover themselves, and pray. They would again remove their clothes afterwards so they would not become tattered. Okay, now comes the important part. They sat in the cave for 12 years. Elijah the prophet came and stood at the entrance to the cave and said, "Who will inform Bar Yochai that the emperor died and his decree has been abrogated?" Okay, so let's pay attention. The first time they leave the cave, who informs them? Elio. Now, some of you know what happens when I'm going to do it outside a little bit, although everyone's welcome to read. What happens when they leave the cave? They've been so spiritually involved for all those years that they can't deal with people involved in mundane behavior. And everywhere they look, burns up. And a heavenly voice says, "Wait, you came out to destroy my world? Get back in the cave." Okay, so they go back into the cave for 12 months. And this time, notice what tells them to get out this time. So I'm now 5 lines from the bottom. A divine voice emerged and said to them, "Emerge from your cave." So remember, it was Elio the first time. It's a bat kol the second time. Okay, now let's go to the last sentence. Okay, very, very beautiful and famous. As the sun was setting on Shabbat Eve, they saw an elderly man who was holding 2 bundles of myrtle branches and running at twilight. They said to him, "Why do you have these?" He said to them, "In honor of Shabbat." They said to him, "And let one suffice. Why do you have 2 myrtle branches?" He answered them, "One is corresponding to remember and one to observe," right? Zachar and Shamar. Rabbi Shimon said to his son, "See how beloved the mitzvah to Israel, their minds were put at ease." Okay, so let's talk about the main theme of the story, and then we'll get to the literary technique here. I think the main theme is pretty clear, right? Rabbis who were involved in very spiritual activities could kind of start to look down at the Balabatim, at the people who are involved in mundane daily behavior, but there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way the world is meant to work. And those people involved in mundane behavior might really love Torah and mitzvot. Look how this fellow runs with the myrtle branches on Friday. Like I always think about this as, people just back from yeshiva in Israel, where they've, now obviously not everybody's like this, okay, but sometimes there's a sense of kind of arrogance, like, I've discovered the reality of the world, like I take Torah seriously, where my old community are just, they're just faking it, right? So that is the message, and they have to learn to appreciate, right, the rest of Am Yisrael. Okay, can we agree that's the message? Okay. Now let's ask 3 interesting questions. Okay, number 1. Notice the fellow is running with myrtle branches. Would it be the same story if he was running with tangerines, with lulavim? Is there any resonance to hadassim that might be relevant here? Okay, Rebecca, you want to say something? Okay. What do you think, guys? If you think about our tradition, what resonance does hadassim have? Okay, I'll give you a hint. Think about the 2 most famous midrashim about the Arba Minim. Okay, what are the 2 most famous midrashim? One is that they're 4 parts of the body. Right, and what's the other most famous one? There are 4 types of Jews. What do you think? Who's the Hadass in that midrash? Okay, so this I have to give credit. This is from Jeff Rubenstein, and I didn't find it in traditional Mefarish. I think it's Jeff's Chiddush, but it's a great Chiddush. Look at source 5. Okay, Vanaf it's about Elu Yisrael. Ma Hadass. What's true at the middle branch? Yesh boreach ve'ein bo tam. It has smell but no taste. Kach Yisrael yesh bem sheyesh bem masim tovim ve'ein bem Torah. There's a model of Jew who might not be so learned, but they do a lot of good things. Would that not be perfect symbolism for our story? Right, that Rosh Hashanah and his son have to come to appreciate these kinds of Jews. Maybe they don't know every Tosfos and Bava Metzia, but they are wonderful people, and that's what the Hadass branch represents. Right? Interesting. Interesting. You're saying reach is not just arbitrary, that there's something to. Okay, terrific. Terrific. We'll have to throw that in also. Okay, let's try two more things though. So I asked you before about placement. Did anyone notice which Masechet this story is in? Shabbos. Okay, one other thing, it's in a parak we call Bameh Madlikin, of which we read the Mishnah on Friday night, which is about what happens just before Shabbos starts. Okay, could one now suggest a different rationale for the placement of the story? Right? After what's happening at the end, we have a fellow running to do honor Shabbat right before Shabbos starts. So I would say the association, for me, this is a great example because the association at the beginning of the story might be like a red herring. It's like a fake out. You think this story is only here to explain why Rabbi Yehuda is Rosh HaMedabrim B'chol Makom, why he's the chief speaker. Nothing doing. It's actually here because this is the chapter about eagerly getting ready just before Shabbat. And that is the conclusion of the story. And that's why this fellow belongs. Okay, so we have another example an example where placement might be significant. Okay, and another object of symbolic significance, like we see the hadas as something with resonance in our tradition. Okay, one more try here. This is the hardest one. If you don't get this, no one should feel badly. Is there a biblical character lurking in the story between the lines? You got to pick one, or maybe not in between the lines. Is there any biblical character? Again, I'll start to spill it out a little bit as you guys are thinking. Someone who has to leave society to hide. Okay, so couldn't you argue that Eliyahu is lurking in the story for two reasons? First of all, he actually appears in the story, right? Eliyahu tells them to come out of the cave, and isn't Eliyahu also a figure who kind of leaves society and has to be fed, right, in a different plane, as it were? And what about thematically? Does Eliyahu fit? Surely Eliyahu does fit. Who's Eliyahu, as it were? Right, the angry prophet who finds it hard to justify Am Yisrael. And Rishon Bar Yochai has to learn to not function like Eliyahu, right? So I would say here we have like 3 for 3. We have the symbolic power of the Hadas branch as the Jew with mitzvah without Torah. We have the placement about getting ready just before Shabbat. And we have Eliyahu lurking as a foil to Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. So one second, Gil. So I just taught this in Maryland, and I want to give credit because the boy said something very clever. Guys, one of the great things about Torah, I'm sure all the rabbis will agree, you're giving a shir the 50th time, and someone makes a comment no one ever thought of before. So a boy named Tani Levison said as follows. He said that maybe that's why Eliyahu gets them out of the cave the first time, and the bat called the second time. Because think about it. What's their attitude the first time? They burn everything up. Namely, they are in Eliyahu mode. What are they able to do the second time they emerge? They're able to look more positively on the rest of Am Yisrael. So arguably, they're no longer in Eliyahu mode. Now a Batko is the one that releases them. Yeah. Right.
The other analogy would be to Abraham, where during the Aggada, first it's the angel, then it's Hashem himself.
Oh, very interesting. Okay.
I'm not sure exactly how that would fit to the story, but it is the two different.
Okay, very good. In fact, I'm going to throw one more thing, Michael, based on your point. Okay, well, maybe this will be a night of confession. I'll admit all the things I was wrong about in the history of my scholarship. So I once wrote, Megillah Esther is full of parallelisms. Okay, the most famous one, of course, is Yosef, but there's several others also. So I once started to get a little skeptical, and I think I wrote somewhere. I don't remember where I wrote it. Like, what are the odds that Esther is parallel to 6 different biblical stories? And I think Yal Ziegler pointed out to me at one point, like, why not? Like, why can't the author do that, right? What if there's 6 stories that are relevant and have resonance? And maybe that's what the author does. So why can't, Esther be parallel to Yosef and Shaul and I don't remember what the other ones are, but whatever they are. So I think you're onto something. Like the fact that without getting to your specifics, the fact that I find an Eliyahu parallel doesn't mean there couldn't also be Avram resonance in the story also. Okay, great. Okay, let's go to a brief one. We'll go back to number 1. Yeah, please, Ray Cohen. So the truth is, see, guys, that's the tricky thing when there are rabbis in the crowd. They won't let you get away with anything. Okay. Uh, I don't have a great approach to the carib tree. I'll just say it can't be an accident. I should throw in the third story that carib trees are in three famous Talmudic stories. Right, carib trees are in. Some of you might remember when Choni, the circle drawer, sees somebody planting, and he's shocked because it takes 70 years for it to bear fruit. That's one. We have it right here, the carib tree in the cave. And you also probably know the story with the oven, where Rabbi Eliezer tries to bring miracles to prove he's right. One of the miracles is that a carib tree is uprooted from its place. So, Rabbi Cohen, I wait to hear from you what it all means. Because no, I think it's true. This is the way life works. Sometimes you file away a question and you're hoping that some year you'll resolve it. But I think you'll agree with me. It's hard to believe it's an accident. Like, how could it be? Oh, it happened to be a carib tree every time, right? There has to be some kind of symbolism with the carib tree. So I'll just mention a marsha. I just think it's not so exciting. Meaning, one of the three. Let's say we're doing the following. We're trying to figure out the symbolism of the carib tree. What would we want to do? What details about a carib tree do we know? So based on the Choni story, what's the one thing we know? That it takes a long time to bear fruit. So that might be the starting point. So the Marsha, one of the most famous commentaries on the Aggada, on the story of the cave, says that it enhances the miracle. That not only did a carib tree grow up overnight, but it's normally the kind of thing that takes a very, very long time to bear fruit. So again, in theory, that could be what's going on, but yeah, I'm not sure. I leave it as a question. One day, one of you will tell me. Okay, great. Let's go back to number one. Okay, and here I think there's very, very beautiful symbolism. Okay, now, can I just ask, is almost everybody familiar with the Kamsa and Bar Kamsa story? Okay, so is it okay if I don't have to summarize it that much? Is that all right? Okay, great. But what happens at the end? So Bar Kamsa is furious that he was thrown out of the party, and he has a suggestion for how to get revenge on Am Yisrael. Okay, so what's his suggestion? So let's look at the last 5 lines in English. Bar Kamsa said to him, send them an offering and see whether they will sacrifice it. Meaning, Bar Kamsa says, the Jews hate you, emperor. They're never going to bring your karban. The emperor went and sent with him a choice 3-year-old calf. Now, in theory, by the way, non-Jews can send animals for karban. So in theory, they could bring it and everyone will be happy. But now Bar Kamsa has a sinister strategy. While Bar Kamsa was coming, he made a blemish on the calf's upper lip. And some say he made the blemish on its eyelids, a place where, according to us, it is a blemish, but according to them, it is not a blemish. So this is a dastardly plan, right? Because based on our halacha, we can't offer the karban. We consider, let's say, a cut lip to be a mum, to be a blemish. But the Romans apparently had different standards. So we wouldn't be able to explain to them, well, we couldn't offer your animal, Caesar, because the lip was cut, right? He would just say, what's the big deal? You could offer such an animal. Okay, next. What do you think about here? It's not so much the object, but the location of the blemish. Where is the blemish here? The blemish is in the lip or the eye. I would get asked the question, would it be the same story if the blemishes were in the ankle and the elbow? Right? Is there something to the blemish being in the lip and the eye? And don't forget, this is a classic Bayit Sheni story, Second Temple period story. Okay, totally correct, Michael. And this the Marsha does say. To me, it's just a no-brainer that this is correct, right? Now, one thing I've been curious about for a long time. Traditionally, the second destruction is attributed to Sinat Chinam, to groundless hatred. In theory, this story is a great example of Sinat Chinam. This is not my topic, but I've wondered for a while why the term does not appear. Okay, because I think what often happens, people teach by Sheni, they say Sinat Chinam, and here's Kamsa Bar Kamsa, which I still think is correct. It's just interesting that for whatever reason, the term Sinat Chinam does not appear in the story. But let's go with Sinat Chinam. And I think here Michael's onto something. Interpersonal ill will. How is that most manifest? It's very simple. It's most manifest in how we speak about each other, and it's most manifest in how we look at each other. Do we look at each other with jealousy, with anger, right? But then it's even better because what's happening to the lip and the eye? They are blemished. What's it saying? Here's a generation which has a blemished looking at things and a blemished way of speaking about things. So this is, again, the Marsha picks up on this in number 2. And I think here the symbolism to me is obvious. Yeah, please. Oh, great. What are you thinking? Wow, terrific. What's your name? Okay, Rabbi Kurtz, we have a future Aggada star here. Okay, okay. Oh, she's currently the Aggada star. Okay, it's not known yet though. Right. Okay. So that was great. Okay, so what if I asked the placement question? Okay, as Toby just did. So Toby, it's not interesting because Rav Tzadok, according to Lublin, I mentioned, insists that placement has meaning, and this is one of his go-to examples. He does it slightly differently than you, but what you said is perfectly legitimate. Okay, let's look at the end of the first line in the Pri Tzadok. Pri Tzadok is from Rav Tzadok. I'll just do a little bit of Hebrew here. Ulefi shahachurban kagerushin. What's Rav Tzadok getting at here? What's he claiming? Well, don't we have a classic metaphor that the relationship between God and the Jewish people is like a married couple? So surely one could view Korban Habayit as a breach in the relationship, almost a divorce, right? That we had this couple that was together. What you said is also great, okay? But he goes a little slightly different direction, right? Maybe there's some kind of divorce here. Now, I think some of you might protest at this point, because, and don't worry, Rav Tzadok's going to make a counter move, which you might say, wait, it's true that it's a breach in the relationship, the destruction of the temple, a serious breach, but not every serious breach is a divorce, right? At the end of the day, don't we believe that God does have an ongoing relationship with the Jewish people? So divorce seems like a very strong term to use. So I'm not going to read it inside. Those of you who want to read it. Rav Tzadok says something really clever. He says, which chapter in Gittin is it in? So, for example, there's a chapter called Hamigaresh. That's a chapter about divorce. This chapter happens to be called Hanizakin, okay, a chapter about damage. And of course, Rav Tzadok can't resist. How does damage differ from divorce? Well, damage you could simply compensate, right? You could fix it. It is not a permanent condition. So Rav Tzadok does something very clever. Notice how he walks a fine line. He says the story is in Gittin because there is a breach in the relationship, but yet it's not a chapter about get because we're trying to convey at the end of the day, it's not a eternal breach, it's a temporary breach. Okay, but again, I think now already, I think we've had, again, as I said, I think Simi Peters has helped me realize how the book could have started. Okay, because I think now we have a series of questions we could ask. Like we'll do more in a second, but every time we have a Talmudic story, we could ask: is the placement significant? Is there a reason why it's here? We could ask: oh, there are a lot of items in the story or numbers. Does one of them have symbolic resonance for us? The number in the story, or the name in the story, or the object in the story. We could ask: is there a biblical association going on? Do we hear Sefer Yon in the background? Do we hear Eliyahu Hanavi in the background? Those are great questions we could ask. I just want to say one thing. This is something that the science people get frustrated with. Like science and math people want there to be definitive answers, right? In literature, there isn't always definitive answers, but that doesn't mean there can't be a really good reading. Okay, but those of you who would like, give me the absolute proof that X was intended, that's not so easy. Okay, although I think the examples I've given are pretty convincing thus far. Okay, any questions thus far before we go to another example? Okay, let us talk about one more technique. Okay, if everyone could go to page 6. Rabbi Kurtz, did you teach this already? This story? Source 6, I'm sorry. So no, if people have studied this already. Okay, great. So here's another technique we didn't talk about yet. What if we have a contrast in the story that the story divides into two equal parts, and there's a huge difference between the first part and the second part? And that's meant to teach me something. I'm supposed to think about why is the first part so different than the second part. So look at this story. This is a great example of this technique. Okay, Rabbi Natan says, there's no mitzvah, however minor, that is written in the Torah, for which there is no reward given in this world, and in the world to come, I do not know how much. So in theory, this is a Gemara about getting reward for mitzvah. Go and learn from the mitzvah of ritual fringes. Tzitzit will teach you that mitzvah would have great reward. Here we go. There was an incident involving a certain man who was diligent about the mitzvah of ritual fringes. So this fellow was very careful about tzitzit, but we'll see he has other issues. This man heard that there was a prostitute in one of the cities overseas who took 400 gold coins as her payment. Now, I have no idea about the going prostitution rate in ancient Babel, but I'm going to assume that's expensive, okay? Okay. He sent her 400 gold coins and fixed the time to meet with her. When his time came, he came and sat at the entrance to her house. The maidservant entered and said to her, that man who sent you 400 gold coins came and sat at the entrance. She said, let him enter. He entered. She arranged 7 beds for him, 6 of silver and 1 of gold. Between each and every one of them, there was a ladder made of silver, and the top bed was the one that was made of gold. She went up and sat naked on the top bed, and he too went up in order to sit naked facing her. In the meantime, okay, so they both get undressed, but don't forget, this fellow was very careful about tzitzit, so he was wearing tzitzit to this episode also. Okay, in the meantime, his 4 ritual fringes came and slapped him on the face. I guess he took off his tzitzit and they slapped him, either literally or metaphorically. He dropped down and sat himself on the ground, and she also dropped down and sat on the ground. Okay, so now he decides he's not going to go through with it. Okay, now comes an absolutely fascinating dialogue. She said to him, I take an oath by the Gap of Rome that I will not allow you to go until you tell me what defect you saw in me. So her first reaction is, oh, he must have seen me as not so beautiful. That's what happened. He said to her, I take an oath by the temple service that I never saw a woman as beautiful as you. But again, there's a mitzvah called tzitzit, and it reminded me not to do the sin. Okay, let's turn the page. We'll see an unbelievable dialogue. Okay, well, I'm in the next page, and the end of the first line. She said to him, I will not allow you to go until you tell me what is your name, and what is the name of your city, and what is the name of your teacher, and what is the name of the study hall in which you study Torah. So quite fascinating, this guy's a yeshiva bacher. Okay. He wrote the information and placed it in her hand. So now she's got his specifics. Okay, she arose. Now, apparently this episode shook her up. She decides to change her whole life. She arose and divided all of her property, giving 1/3 to the government, 1/3 to the poor, right? She's becoming much more benevolent. And she took 1/3 with her in her possession in addition to these bedsmiths. She came to the study hall of Rabbi Chia and said to him, now she comes to Rabbi Chia's study hall because Rabbi Chia is the Rebbe of this fellow. She says to Rabbi Chia, my teacher, instruct me and have them make me a convert. Rabbi Chia said to her, my daughter, perhaps you set your sights on one of the students. Like maybe you're not really authentically motivated. You just find one of these Shiva guys cute. She took the note and gave it to Rabbi Chia. Now here's something I've wondered about for years. It's not 100% clear how she convinces Rabbi Chia of her sincerity. But somehow she does. Like she gives him a note and convinces Rabbi Chia of her sincerity. He said to her, go take possession of your purchase. Those bread spreads that she had arranged for him in a prohibited fashion, she now arranged for him in a permitted fashion. Okay, great. Now again, in theory, this was a story about tzitzit. But here I want to give credit to Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, was a well-known community rabbi and thinker in America in the 20th century. He has a beautiful, beautiful reading of the story. And it starts with the technique I just mentioned. He says, what if I contrast the first part of the story and the second part? So what would happen if I asked you, what's the difference between the two main protagonists, right? Between the prostitute and this yeshiva fellow? How do they interact in the first half of the story? And how do they interact in the second half of the story? What would you say is the major difference in their interaction, in their conversation, one might say? Okay, so let's try this. Okay, here I come. Okay, very good, very good. So the truth is, it is interesting because I wasn't going to go in that direction, but Rabbi Cohen's absolutely right. One of the interesting shifts is that he's the main player in the first part, and in many ways, she becomes the heroine in the second part. I think you're totally right about that. Okay, what conversation passes between them in the first part of the story? Okay, but take a look carefully. How many things do they say to each other in the first part of the story? The answer actually is nothing. How does the conversation take place? Through the avenue of the maidservant, right? The maidservant says the fellow's there, right? And she says to the maidservant, tell him to come in. The first time they actually talk is when he gets off the bed. That's number one, right? Brookfitz points out. Now, what does she say to him at some point? What's your name? Now, that's a pretty powerful thing, because what does that mean? Then the first half of the story, she didn't know his name. So now you could say it two ways. I think one way, they're both great, but one's even deeper. One is that he has no name in the first part of the story, and he gets a name in the second part. Or he does have a name in the first part of the story. But his name is not, I don't know, Baruch Schwartz or something like that. What's his name in the first part of the story? He is referred to. How is he referred to? Okay, and one more, a little bit later. Okay, even a little bit later. There's a case where someone refers to him, right? The maidservant refers to him. How does she call him? Couldn't you argue that his name in the first part of the story is 400 gold coin man? Right, that's who he is. So Ray Berkowitz, I'm sorry? Yes. So Ray Berkowitz, if anyone wants to read this, it's in Crisis in Faith. It's a chapter called Jewish Sexual Ethics. And Ray Berkowitz says that I think it was reprinted actually in the volume called Essential Essays. Ray Berkowitz says this Gemara is outlining two different relationships between men and women. Okay, one is when each one is using the other one as an object, and obviously prostitution is the strongest example of that. And in prostitution, so right, for this fellow, she's just a source of pleasure. For her, he's just a source of money. So at that point, they don't really need to talk to each other. And not only that, in a very profound sense, what's his identity, as Michael says? His identity is the guy who provides 40 gold coins. That's who he is. Once she's intrigued by him as a person, because he didn't go through with it, all of a sudden she needs to know his name. Right? So I think this is a very, very powerful read, and it's part of what I think Judaism, with its restraint on sexual ethics, is trying to accomplish. Right? That we're not against sexuality, but we want it to happen in the second model over here, and not in the first model. Okay, two more points. Oh, I'm lucky here because every time I make cultural references, my students are much too young to get them. But you guys might actually get this one. We'll give it a shot. Okay, how many of you liked ER when it was playing? There we go. Just go. Okay, a bunch of you. Okay, so maybe even remember this episode. So in ER, the George Clooney character was a bit of a womanizer. You guys remember that? Okay, so listen to the following episode. It's amazing. Okay, so an episode starts and Clooney's in bed with a woman, and she has some kind of seizure. Does anyone remember this episode? Okay, so of course he grabs her, puts her in the car, runs her to the hospital, and as he's running and carrying her, his friend Green, I don't remember who played him, says to him, "What's her name? Let's get her records." And the Clooney character says, "I don't know." And then they go to a commercial. So I'm probably the only person in America who did this, but I was thinking, some yeshiva kid read Rabbi Berkowitz wrote this. And there's no question. It just can't be. It's too coincidental. How could it be? Like, think about how prominent Jews are in Hollywood. Somebody read Rabbi Berkowitz says, okay, because if you think it's a very powerful scene, right? Like he was willing to go to bed with her and didn't need to know her name. That is a pretty powerful thing to say about somebody. No, I admit I didn't do that much research. So I guess if I was really into it, I would check. The truth is, I'm thinking remind me guys, the 1990s, yeah, this was way before, Wikipedia, right? No, because now I could probably find out pretty similar who wrote that episode, and I think at the time there was no way to do that, right? 1990s, right? There's no way to do that then. Okay, but you're right. Maybe I'll check it. I'll let you know if we find out which yeshiva guy did it. Okay, so that I think is quite powerful. One more thing here, guys, just to make it even stronger. Okay, I think again this is a very, very strong reading. There are a couple of objects in the story, and we've talked about how objects could have resonance. And maybe I'll sum up with this and close. Okay, notice there were beds. We could talk about the silver and gold beds, but I'm going to leave that aside. Anyone notice anything about the monetary amount? 400 coins? What does that make you think of? Yeah, isn't that what Avram pays for Marada Machpelah, for Sarah's burial ground? Now, here, now I admit, guys, someone could complain that, well, here it's Zahav and there it's Kesef. But I still think it's pretty striking that you have 400 coins and 400 coins. So look at the Karen Ora. This is where sometimes Achronim frustrate me. Okay, look at the Karen Ora in source 7. You'll see what I mean. The Arba Meut Zehuvim Anitan Beschara, the 400 gold coins, Heim Umat, they correspond to Arba Meut Shekel Kesef Asher Nitan Bekinyan Ste Machpelah. So he makes Gil's point, right? He makes this parallel, but here's where he really frustrates me. Look at the last line. The Havein. What does that mean, basically? Yeah, and you should understand the deeper meaning, but he doesn't tell us. So I have to admit, I love the carried over, but it's not obvious what the deeper meaning is. I don't know why he went with the Havein on this one rather than spelling it out. Okay, but based on Rabbi Berkowitz's reading, what do you think? Could we work out this parallel to the Avram story? I think it works very nicely. After all, what's Avram doing? He is honoring his deceased wife. Right? When someone's honoring their deceased spouse, they're obviously not getting anything from the spouse anymore. It's not some utilitarian calculation. It rather is just one of love and dedication. So that, of course, is the second model of relationship and not the first model. So I think here we have two techniques that work. We have this split of two parts of the story. And we'd have, again, an object that reminds us of a biblical story, which adds weight. Yeah?
Might also be a good contrast because the story is an object, but Chazal tells us that Abraham took a while to actually see the beauty of Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't actually view her as this object for his pleasure.
Okay, good. Very good. Okay, so just to sum up, and Michael suggested at this point I take questions. So I think now we really have like a bunch of 4 or 5 questions we could ask in every story. Now, again, I'm not going to be so rigid that, oh, those are the only questions you could ask or the questions you have to ask. I'm not so into methodology being that rigid, but it's just a possibility. Again, I think we could always ask, is there a reason why it's placed where it is? And really notice that could be the entire Masechet or the specifics of where in the Masechet. We could ask, does anything have biblical resonance in the story? Obviously, if you're a Jewish writer, Tanakh is always lurking. We could ask, does any object or number or name have symbolic significance? And now we could also ask, is there a key transition in the story? Okay, like we have right here. There's a key transition where suddenly everything functions differently. Right? He gets off the bed and their discourse and relationship totally shifts. I think if we ask those questions, it'll often lead to very good results. Like, was I good now? Now we'll take questions. Okay, anyone with questions on what we've done, on the methodology, on specific stories?
What inspired you to focus on this?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, very good, very good. Thank you. So I think I would say as follows. Like, I enjoy Gemara very much, but some of you may know in the world of yeshivot, it tends to focus on the halachic sections more than the Aggadic sections. Right, the principles of Jewish law are somehow viewed as the meat and potatoes of Talmudic study, and not Aggada. In fact, not in every shir, but in some shirim, the Rebbe will kind of either skip it or read it very perfunctorily. And at some point, I started to realize that not only do I love Aggada, but I think for many of our students, the meaning of it is more easily found in Aggadic stories than in halachic works. Like, again, I think there are answers to the question, but some of our students might ask, how crucial is it to my religious life? What happens when an ox scores a cow? Now, I think there are answers, but I think those same students who struggle with that will often be inspired by Rishon B'Yachai in the cave or Choni Amagel in the carob tree. So in my mind, it was almost like a wasted resource that we have this depth of beautiful stories in the Aggada, and here the yeshiva world is kind of not really giving it its due. So that was the crusade. Okay, I'm still on the crusade. I have several others also, but thank you. Now that we have Rabbi Kurtz and others, we have there are more soldiers in this crusade. It's getting exciting. Yeah, please. Can you remind me your first name? When you get out there, I want to make sure to say I knew where we went. Okay. There you go. Thank you. Oh, okay. So I'm going to answer your question, but also raise one other point, which I should have raised before, which I actually don't think you have to believe they're true. I also would argue that that is often not the most important question. Meaning, it's clear that Chazal were not so interested in history. Now, it doesn't mean we can't get historical information from the rabbis of the Talmud, but they didn't just tell stories because they happened to happen. They told the stories with a very strong sense of educational import. Once that's true, I think the real question is not did this occur, but what is the story meant to instruct us? So I realize in a certain sense you could say I'm ducking your question, but if you want to know, I don't think you have to say they all happened. But in my mind, it's not even the most important question. I think the most important question is what does each story tell us? That's the most important question, less about the historical record. Is that fair? Right. Yeah, I'm not committed to them, all of them being, yeah. Yeah, look, again, I wouldn't assume that there's no historical basis whatsoever, but right, right. What's the one other thing I wanted to say? I meant to say one other thing, guys, just before everybody gets excited and don't realize sometimes the difficulty. There are I obviously in the book and tonight focus on Agadot, where the meaning is not so elusive and pretty influential and instructive and inspiring. Obviously, sometimes we have a story we just don't know what to make of it. So I just want to warn you that that's out there also, right? Again, this does not mean we should shy away or refrain, but every once in a while you're saying like, wait, what does it mean that he encountered a 13-headed demon in the Beit Midrash? Like, what is that? What is the significance of that symbolism? And sometimes we don't know. But I think that's okay. As I said before, like sometimes life is, oh, I have a question, I'll put it aside. Hopefully, in 5 years, I'll be able to answer the question. Okay, but just realize some stories are not going to lend themselves to immediate gratification, as it were. Okay, anybody else? Yeah, Rabbi Kurtz?
So the answer you gave for Toby vis-a-vis Agudath, you extrapolate that to Tanakh as well.
Okay, look, that's a good question. I would say as follows. Obviously, Tanakh is more sensitive because a lot of Tanakh is the foundation of our beliefs, right? That we were taken out of Egypt, that we received the Torah. So for most of Chumash, I would not go in that direction. But I don't see why for certain elements of Tanakh you can't say that. For example, some of you may know that there's a position in the Gemara that Eov was just a metaphor. There wasn't actually a man named Eov. And if someone told me, I realize it's not so traditional. If someone told me that Yonah is a metaphorical story, it would not like shake my faith. I would be like, oh, I think that would be okay. So I would differentiate there between Chumash and Ksuv in particular, and maybe Navi a little bit also. All right. Okay. It has been a pleasure. Whenever you like always, thank you very much. I want to thank Michael for arranging it. And okay. Yeah, sure. If I'm just gonna. If you just give me 2 minutes.